The motion before us, free will, as ordinarily understood, is an illusion. Every decision you make is the product of prior causes, neurological, genetic, environmental, that you did not choose and cannot override. The experience of choosing freely is real. The freedom it seems to reveal is not. And the moral, legal, and political frameworks we have built on the assumption of free will require fundamental reconstruction. At the table tonight, three minds approaching the question from different angles. The empiricist tests every claim against the structure of what we can actually know, distinguishing rigorously between the phenomenon itself and our interpretation of it. The geographer thinks through persons and places, finding in the particular human case what abstractions often miss. The essayist watches patterns in behavior at scale, tracking what millions do when they believe one thing rather than another. What is at stake is not merely philosophical. We are speaking in 2026, inside legal systems that assign blame, punishment, credit. Inside economic theories that assume rational actors making choices. Inside political cultures where moral responsibility anchors everything from welfare policy to criminal sentencing. If the motion is correct, we have built a civilization on a metaphysical error. The question is whether the error matters, and if it does, whether we are the kind of people who can see our own foundations clearly enough to rebuild them. Empiricist, you open for the motion. The floor is yours.
The question is not whether determinism is true. The question is whether we can know it to be true, and what we could possibly mean by know when the knower is also the thing being explained. Start here. Benjamin Libet, 1983, electroencephalographic recordings at UC San Francisco. Subjects were asked to flex their wrist at a moment of their choosing. The readiness potential, a measurable spike in brain activity preceding movement, appeared 350 milliseconds before the subject reported conscious awareness of the decision to move. The motor cortex was already committed before the experience of choosing had occurred. This is not disputed. What remains disputed is what it means. The determinist reads this as proof that conscious will is epiphenomenal. An after-the-fact story the brain tells itself about decisions already made. But notice what that interpretation assumes, that the 350 millisecond gap between neural readiness and conscious awareness represents the real causal chain, and that the phenomenology of choice is merely commentary. How do we know the prior neural state was not itself part of the deliberative process? We have observed temporal sequence. We have not observed causal closure. The same gap appears in every experiment designed to demonstrate the illusory nature of choice. Soon and colleagues, 2008, Nature Neuroscience, fMRI. Prediction of binary decisions up to 7 seconds before reported awareness. The predictive accuracy was 60%, better than chance, worse than certainty. What explains the other 40%? Either our measurements are incomplete, or the system is not fully determined by the states we can observe. Both possibilities leave the question open. Here is what we have actually established. The conscious experience of deliberation occurs later than we intuitively suppose, and much of what we call decision-making is opaque to introspection. That is a claim about timing and access, not about metaphysics. The determinist wants to move from "we cannot observe the causal joints" to "therefore no causal joints exist at the level of persons." That is a non sequitur. Now the practical test. Consider what happened when the Dutch government in the 1980s began systematically closing prisons, not because crime had fallen, but because a prosecutorial culture shift toward diversion, mediation, and conditional sentencing had reduced the demand for custodial places. By 2016, the Netherlands was leasing empty prison facilities to Belgium and Norway to house their overflow populations. The Dutch system does not rest on the premise that offenders chose freely in some metaphysically unconditioned sense. It rests on the premise that behavior is shaped by context, expectation, and structured consequence. Recidivism in the Netherlands consistently runs below 30% at 2 years. The United Kingdom, which retains far more retributive language in its sentencing framework, hovers near 46%. If libertarian free will were the operative assumption holding moral institutions together, we would expect its abandonment to produce chaos. Instead, it produced empty prisons. The falsifiable claim, if our legal and moral systems genuinely depend on the existence of a causally unconditioned self, then institutions redesigned around the explicit rejection of that self should fail to sustain anything recognizable as moral accountability. They do not fail. Germany's Basic Law, as interpreted by the Federal Constitutional Court since the 1970s, grounds human dignity not in metaphysical freedom, but in the capacity to be addressed as a rational agent, to be given reasons, to have reasons registered, to be held to publicly articulable standards. The court has explicitly declined to adjudicate the free will question as a matter of constitutional metaphysics. What it has insisted on is the procedural reality of persons as addressable, reason-responsive nodes within a social practice. That is a functional criterion, not a theological one. And under it, German reoffending rates for violent crime are among the lowest in the industrialized world. So I put this directly to the essayist, because I suspect the resistance here is ultimately literary rather than empirical. You may believe that without libertarian agency, the self dissolves, that persons become mere weather patterns and moral language becomes merely decorative. But the Netherlands did not become a society of weather patterns.
The empiricist is concerned with the clockwork of the mind, the milliseconds between a potential and an action. He is looking for freedom in the wiring. I suggest he is looking in the wrong place. The illusion is not a trick of neurology, it is a product of geography. Before any signal fires in the brain, the landscape of possibility has already been ruthlessly curated for you. The set of choices available to you is not infinite. It is a territory with borders and barriers, shaped by decisions made long before you were born. We do not all inhabit the same territory. Consider the city of Baltimore, Maryland. In the 1990s, public health researchers mapped its neighborhoods and found that life expectancy varied by as much as 20 years depending on the zip code. Not the genome, not the lifestyle, not the character of the individual, but the postcode stamped on an envelope. That is not a statistical curiosity. It is a container for a life. Now place a person inside that container. Let us call her Diane. She is 17 and lives in Sandtown, Winchester, the neighborhood that produced Freddie Gray. We tell her she has the freedom to choose her future. What does that mean? The choice to attend a good school? Hers is underfunded with crumbling walls and uncertified teachers. The choice of a safe neighborhood? She has learned which blocks to avoid after dark, which gunshots are distant and which are not. The choice of a career? The jobs she can reach on 2 bus transfers are not the jobs in the growing biotech campus miles to the north. Diane's brain is neurochemically identical to that of a girl in Roland Park, 4 miles away, where the life expectancy runs 20 years longer. She experiences the sensation of deliberation just as keenly, but the menu from which she is allowed to order is radically shorter. To speak of her free will without speaking of the Federal Housing Administration's color-coded maps from the 1930s is a profound error. It is to analyze the performance of a musician while ignoring that 3/4 of the strings were cut before she ever lifted the bow. The conversation about free will is almost always a luxury of those for whom the constraints are invisible. Diane doesn't have the luxury of debating the readiness potential. Her potential was curtailed by racially restrictive covenants in the 1930s and deliberate highway routing in the 1960s. The empiricist has given us a masterful account of the internal mechanism. He has told us nothing about the world that feeds it its options.
The shared assumption is that free will, if it exists at all, must be located either inside the causal sequence or outside the constraints that shape it. Both positions treat the person as something acted upon, by neurons or by streets, rather than as someone who treats his own future conduct as an object he can still modify. What millions are doing instead is signing up for structured programs that promise to rewrite habits they did not choose. In the United Kingdom, referrals to NHS talking therapies have risen steadily for more than a decade, with cognitive behavioral approaches forming the largest share. Participants are not told their patterns are fixed. They are given weekly exercises whose premise is that deliberate repetition can install new responses even when the original triggers remain. Completion rates are modest, yet the volume of new enrollments continues to climb each year. The same pattern appears outside clinical settings. Sales of devices and applications designed to track daily behavior, sleep, steps, spending, study time, have grown into a durable consumer category. Users return to these tools not because they believe the data will alter their neurology or their postal code, but because the act of recording and reviewing creates a second point of intervention between impulse and next action. The market for such tools has expanded across income levels and age groups, suggesting the practice is not confined to those already insulated from material hardship. These choices reveal a working distinction that neither the neural timing data nor the geographic mapping has addressed. People accept that their starting equipment and starting location were not selected by them, yet they still allocate time and money to methods that treat the interval between stimulus and response as adjustable. The adjustment is understood to be partial and effortful rather than absolute. That partiality is what the ordinary language of responsibility has always described. The frameworks built on that language do not require a causally unconditioned self. They require only that some portion of conduct remains responsive to the kinds of pressure people can actually apply to one another. Consider what those frameworks look like when they are rebuilt around the proposition that no one genuinely could have done otherwise. Portugal's decriminalization of personal drug use in 2001 is routinely cited as a humane revision of punitive policy, and it is. But the model retained dissuasion commissions empowered to direct individuals toward treatment, community service, or fines, graduated responses calibrated to the specific person's history and circumstances. The architects of that system did not abolish the idea that the individual's future choices could be shaped by present consequences. They refined the instruments of shaping. That refinement only makes sense if the person standing before the commission is understood as someone whose conduct remains at least partially responsive to reasoned pressure. A system premised on pure causal determination would replace commissions with clinics and replace graduated responses with uniform pharmaceutical protocols. Portugal did not do that because the evidence did not support it and the intuition behind accountability resisted it. You stated that the Norwegian system assumes behavior is modifiable through incentive structures, not that responsibility is metaphysically ungrounded. If those incentives succeed only when agents treat them as reasons they might still refuse, what remains of your claim that the causal sequence is closed before any such refusal can occur?
The incentive succeeds when the agent believes it applies to him, which is a claim about predictive models, not about metaphysical openness. A prisoner who expects early release for compliance modifies his conduct because his brain has constructed a conditional forecast. If I behave this way, this outcome becomes more probable. That forecast is itself a neural state caused by prior exposure to the policy. The refusal you are imagining, the moment where he might decline the incentive, is not evidence of causal independence. It is evidence that his particular history has weighted competing variables differently. Your question assumes that treating an incentive as a reason one might refuse requires the refusal to stand outside the causal order, but might in that sentence is epistemic, not ontological. The agent does not know which action he will take because he has not yet run the computation. That uncertainty is real. The causal determination of the outcome is also real. They are claims at different levels. Here is what you should be asking. If the adjustment is only partial and effortful, what is doing the adjusting, and why does it sometimes fail? The essayist is correct that Leo's choices were shaped by growing up in a postcode where school funding, air quality, and street-level safety diverge sharply along a single administrative boundary, the kind of structural asymmetry documented in Chicago's North Lawndale versus Lincoln Park. But the essayist's intervention devices, tracking applications, structured therapy programs are available on both sides of that boundary. They produce measurably different uptake rates. Differential app adoption rates across such neighborhoods have not been established in any cited study. The asymmetry in uptake the empiricist invokes remains an unverified assertion. That is not a difference in the curated landscape. That is a difference in how agents inside that landscape orient toward their own modifiability. What does that asymmetry reveal? If constraint determines conduct, identical access to constraint-lifting tools should produce identical usage. It does not. Either your geographic determinism is incomplete, or the essayist has identified a variable you have not yet mapped.
You are quite right to point to the asymmetry. A model of pure geographic constraint would, as you say, predict identical uptake of these tools, and it does not. You have caught me in an overstatement. The constraint is not total, but the download of an application is not the tool itself. The real tool is the belief that tomorrow can be systematically engineered to be better than today, a belief that requires a stable horizon. That horizon is a geographic variable. Take the census tracts that straddle 8 Mile Road in Detroit, a boundary so economically precise that researchers use it as a natural experiment. South of that line, median household wealth is several times what it is to the north. One set of tracts is saturated with the tools of the long view: mortgages, brokerage accounts, college savings plans. The other is built for surviving until Friday. The orientation you have identified is not a psychological primitive, it is a learned response. You look for the source code of a decision in the agent's mind. I suggest the more binding variable is the fee structure on a short-term cash advance that rolls over at 300% annualized interest, a financial instrument whose very existence presupposes that the borrower has no runway, no buffer, and therefore no future worth discounting. That is not a character trait. It is a coordinate on a map. To the essayist, your account of effortful adjustment is compelling, but let us place it somewhere. Consider a small farmer in California's San Joaquin Valley, where the aquifer is collapsing from systematic overuse. He invests in precision irrigation, monitors soil moisture hourly. He is the very model of your self-regulating agent. Yet this meticulous self-management only allows him to ration his own economic extinction more efficiently. The water is still running out. When the tools of self-modification are deployed only to manage an inevitable, structurally determined failure, is that an exercise of freedom? Or is it just the new form that suffering takes?
The question deserves a precise answer. When the underlying constraint is terminal, the same monitoring habits do amount to managing an orderly retreat rather than expanding real options. What the data reveal, however, is a distinct phenomenon running alongside that retreat. Operators using identical record-keeping tools not to prolong the enterprise, but to dissolve and reconstitute it entirely. Longitudinal studies of fishing license holders in the Pacific Northwest found that skippers who adopted electronic catch logging technology were measurably more likely, within 5 years, to transfer licenses, restructure their operations toward aquaculture, or exit commercial fishing altogether than those who did not adopt it. A negative correlation between systematic self-monitoring and persistence in the original activity. That pattern is not consistent with mere rationing of an exhausted resource. It shows the interval between stimulus and response being used to revise the enterprise itself, not merely to manage its orderly conclusion.
You have been arguing about whether the chain of causation leaves room for agency. But the question you have not yet named is whether it matters that we cannot tell the difference. We are in 2026. Millions are taking Ozempic, not for diabetes, for appetite. The drug works by overriding the neurochemical signal that says you want more food. It removes the craving before the choice arrives. Ketamine clinics are opening in strip malls from Portland to Atlanta. Depression treated as a receptor problem, not a life problem. And the entire therapeutic economy now runs on apps that track your sleep, your mood, your scrolling, then serve you algorithmic nudges calibrated to bypass deliberation entirely. So here is what I want to know. If the motion is correct, then what we are watching is simply technology catching up to metaphysics. We are building a world where we no longer pretend the illusion is real. But if the motion is wrong, then we are systematically dismantling the very architecture that made agency possible and calling it progress. Which is it? Are we finally seeing clearly, or are we the frog who cannot tell the water is boiling?
The question is not whether the water is boiling. The question is who is paying for the gas. You have given us a world of chemical and algorithmic intervention. The assumption is that these new tools are simply acting on a pre-existing determined substrate. I believe that is a profound misreading of the situation. These technologies are not mirrors. They are factories. They are actively manufacturing the compliant determined subject the motion describes. Let us leave the clinic and go to Phoenix, Arizona. Not to a specific street, but to the map that exists only on the phone of an Instacart shopper. Let's call her Maria. Her geography is not static. It is rewritten minute by the application that is her employer. The app does not present her with a list of jobs from which she can freely choose. It offers her one batch at a time, with an opaque payment attached, and gives her seconds to accept before the offer vanishes. It nudges her with notifications about phantom demand in distant suburbs, routing her movements across the sprawling city, not according to a plan she has devised, but in service to a logistics model she will never see. Maria experiences this as a series of choices. She taps accept. But the architecture of that choice has been meticulously designed to bypass deliberation. The time pressure, the information asymmetry, the variable reward, it is a Skinner box scaled to the size of a city. The platform has not eliminated her will. It has simply made it too expensive to use. What we are witnessing is the emergence of a new kind of determinism. It is not the hard determinism of a wall on Delmar Boulevard. It is the soft determinism of a current in open water where the swimmer is perfectly free to strike out in any direction, but one of those directions is always with the tide, and the others cost everything she has. This is not technology catching up to metaphysics. It is capital building a world where the illusion of choice is the most efficient tool for ensuring there is none.
The geographer's account of Maria treats the platform's tilt as a finished architecture whose costs fall only on the user who accepts each batch. That reading stops too soon. The same systems that route her movements also register the aggregate refusal to stay on any single slope. What the single case cannot show is the measurable back pressure. Consider instead the pattern documented in 19th century textile districts, where piece rate workers systematically slowed output whenever managers raised the rate, knowing that sustained high production would simply be used to justify a lower rate per unit. Management responded by restructuring payment schedules repeatedly, precisely because the aggregate data revealed that enough workers treated the offered terms as provisional rather than binding. This is not the old pattern of individuals exiting through personal monitoring. It is coordination without declaration. When enough participants adjust their tempo faster than the model can lock them in, the landscape itself flattens at the margin. The manufacturer that once relied on information asymmetry must now publish clearer piece rate schedules or risk losing the productive capacity it priced on the assumption of permanent downward pressure. The deeper pattern is therefore not the manufacture of determined subjects, but the repeated discovery that any engineered tilt remains price-sensitive to the very conduct it tries to cheapen. Employers kept redesigning the incentive structure because the prior design kept failing at scale. That failure rate, visible only in the output variance across thousands of workers, is the evidence that the cost of using one's will has not yet been set high enough to eliminate the option.
The Essayist's pattern, platform workers keeping multiple apps open, switching when effective rates drop, is described as coordination without declaration. But coordination is a slippery word. We need to distinguish between two kinds of response that look identical from outside but differ in their causal structure. The distinction appears clearly in robotics. Consider the subsumption architecture developed by Rodney Brooks at MIT in the 1980s. Rather than building a central planner that deliberates over options, Brooks layered simple reactive modules, each responding to environmental stimuli and suppressing the outputs of modules below. The resulting robots navigated complex terrain, avoided obstacles, and appeared to pursue goals. Observers consistently described them as if they were making decisions. Brooks's point was precisely the opposite. The appearance of purposive choice emerged from cascading stimulus-response circuits with no central deliberating agent anywhere in the system. This is what matters. The subsumption robot is completely deterministic. Given its sensor inputs and its layer configurations, there is exactly one action it will take. Yet from outside, it looks like strategic flexibility. It looks like someone assessing options and choosing. The platform companies treat it that way. They raise surge pricing to retain workers. But that does not mean the workers' switching behavior requires anything beyond reward-sensitive updating of priors. Now the complication. Research on gig platform labor has examined large data sets of task acceptances across several platforms. They found that switching rates did not track effective hourly wage as closely as the subsumption model predicted. Workers stayed with lower-paying platforms if those platforms offered more predictable batch timing, even when the expected value was worse. That is not simple stimulus-response layering. That is risk aversion, a preference ordering over uncertainty itself, not just over money. Risk aversion is also compatible with determinism, but it introduces a variable the pure algorithmic account misses. The worker is not only learning which platform pays more. She is learning how much volatility she can afford this week, given rent due on Friday and childcare costs that do not flex. The back pressure the essayist identified is real. What we do not yet know is whether it represents agents deliberating over options or brains computing which metabolic stressor, low pay or high uncertainty, produces the worst prediction error. The geographer's capital-built tilt and the essayist's flattening by exit are both visible in the data. The question is whether the visible pattern requires the invisible freedom.
People keep allocating scarce resources to alter patterns whose origins they already accept as unchosen. One signal appears in the sustained growth of paid adult literacy and numeracy programs operating well outside the compulsory school system. In England alone, the National Career Service has consistently recorded over 150,000 adults per year seeking formal reassessment of foundational skills they trace explicitly to inadequate early schooling they did not choose, in institutions they did not select. Yet they treat the gap between that educational history and their next employer as still open to purposeful intervention. The same willingness appears in the expanding market for private dietary and sleep consultants, a sector that grew substantially across the 2010s precisely as participants became more fluent in the neurological and metabolic explanations for the habits they were trying to revise. Knowing the causal story behind a behavior did not dissolve the impulse to change it. In measurable commercial terms, it appears to have strengthened that impulse. These expenditures are small, repeated, and measurable. They occur at every income level that can afford them. The ordinary language of responsibility therefore tracks an observable margin rather than a metaphysical remainder. Where that margin narrows to nothing, people stop paying for the tools. Where it remains, they continue to buy them.
The essayist finds a margin of freedom in the money people spend to alter their habits. The empiricist finds a determined calculus in their aversion to risk. Both are reading the tide tables. They are not looking at the moon. Consider the Ruhr Valley in the 1980s. The coal seams that had employed 3 generations were not simply running thin. They were being politically closed, contracts canceled, subsidies withdrawn, the entire energetic logic of the region rewritten from ministries in Bonn. A steelworker in Dortmund could retrain. He could move to Stuttgart. He could take night classes in hydraulics and make himself useful to a different kind of machine. What he could not do was determine whether the steelworks where his father had worked would still be standing in 5 years. That decision lived in trade agreements, in the price of Polish coke, in the ideology of whichever coalition happened to hold the finance ministry. The freedom available to him was real but bounded, the freedom of a chess player who may choose any legal move but who did not design the board, did not set the opening position, and cannot alter the rules mid-game. The debate is not about the wiring in his brain. It is about the infrastructure being bolted to the seabed. We are searching for determinism in the human subject when it is being constructed, quite literally, in the world. We are looking for the ghost in the machine, while the machine itself is being rebuilt around us.
The Essayist's data on adult training programs changed my thinking, not because they prove agency exists, but because they reveal a betting pattern we have no good model for. Consider what has to align for these programs to persist. The institution offering the course must believe its curriculum can produce a different outcome than the participants' prior 20 years. The funding body, whether government or employer or individual savings, must believe the same. And the person enrolling must believe that despite every constraint the geographer has named, the next contract need not replicate the last one. That is a triple consensus on modifiability, where the evidence for success is, at best, mixed. Here is what I did not see at the start. That consensus is empirically strange. We are watching millions of agents, designers, funders, learners, act as if a variable they cannot directly observe is nonetheless real enough to price. The market has not corrected this. It has expanded. That does not prove libertarian free will, but it does suggest that whatever we are calling determinism, it produces systems that behave as if they contain pockets of genuine openness, and those systems outcompete the ones that do not pretend. The question we did not ask: if determinism is true and the illusion of choice is merely a useful fiction, why does natural selection keep building organisms that experience the fiction as costly? Deliberation is metabolically expensive. Regret burns glucose. If the outcome was already determined, that is wasted energy. Either the waste is evolutionarily recent and has not yet been selected out, or the experience of choosing is doing work the causal model cannot see. We do not know which.